Okay, I'm going to pick up where we left off earlier. In John chapter 11, we're going to begin with verse 45. Now, we have to remember that Jesus has just raised Lazarus from the dead. He's only 2 miles from Jerusalem when he does this. And there were people from Jerusalem there when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And so there's all kinds of witnesses that saw him come out. That all kinds of witnesses that, number one, knew he was dead, knew he was in the grave for 4 days, and Jesus raised him from the dead. And they go back into Jerusalem and they start telling these things. Well, it was the people in Jerusalem who wanted to kill him just earlier. Uh, it was December when Jesus was there before, and they wanted to stone him and kill him. And now uh, Jesus has come back. It's, very early in the spring or, late winter when he's there, winter in the northern hemisphere. And so all of these people who have a hatred toward Jesus and want to see him dead get word of him raising Lazarus from the dead. And so in verse 45, it says, "Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin, or the Sanhedrin." So as I said, a lot of witnesses. Some of them went back and told the Pharisees what happened. And then the word got to the chief priests about it. And of course, the chief priests, they were Sadducees. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection, but the Sadducees didn't. And so they called together a meeting of the Sanhedrin, which is or was the ruling council of the Jews. There were 70 of them, plus the high priest and another man who was close to the high priest. And so there were 72 altogether who were called together to find out what they're going to do about this. Here, this man is raising the dead. And so they say in the second half of verse 47, "What are we accomplishing? Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." So they see Jesus as a threat. Besides all the other miracles that they've heard of him doing, miracles that they've seen him doing, healing people, opening blind eyes, things like that. Now he's raised someone from the dead, and there are credible witnesses to it. And whether they believe it or not, they know that the people will believe that he raised Lazarus from the dead. And they feel that if more and more people follow him, it'll become an insurrection, that they will try to overthrow the government. And that will bring the Romans down on them, because the Romans, they were these overlords. They were the ones who ruled the country. And the Sanhedrin said, they'll take away our place and they'll take away our nation. This idea of taking away our place can also be translated temple. They'll take away our temple, our place of worship. But I think they were more concerned about themselves, that no longer would they be the rulers, and no longer would they have all of the money that the temple brought in. And so they were concerned about themselves. They were ripping the people off. They were stealing from the people. And so they said, they'll take away our temple, our place, and they'll take away our nation. And in verse 49, it says, Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it's better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. He, in his mind, was thinking, we need to kill this man, Jesus, before he leads this insurrection and people follow him and the Romans come down on us and destroy our nation, destroy us, take away our place, take away our temple, and take away and prevent us from being the rulers anymore. And so he says it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to die. But John tells us that it was a whole lot more than that, what the man said. Verse 51, John tells us he didn't say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. What John is saying is that this high priest didn't know it, but he was actually prophesying. As the high priest, he was prophesying that Jesus would have to die for all the people of Israel, but not just the ones living in the land, but for the nation of Israel scattered throughout the world. And it was in order to bring them together as one people. And then John tells us from that day on, they plotted to kill Jesus. Verse 54, Therefore Jesus no longer moved about publicly amongst the Jews. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the desert, in a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. So Jesus didn't stay there near Jerusalem because it wasn't his time yet. He didn't go back across the Jordan River where he had been. He went north to a place in the desert country, to a town called Ephraim, and he stayed with some people there who were followers of his. And then it says in verse 55, When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleaning before the Passover. They kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple area, they asked one another, What do you think? Is he coming to the feast at all? But the chief priests and Pharisees had given orders that if anyone found out where Jesus was, he should report it, so they may arrest him. It says when it was almost time for the Passover. The Passover happens right after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox. In the northern hemisphere, that's going to be in March, late March, early April. And so that's the time of year that Jesus is there. And when people came to the Passover, they couldn't just come and celebrate the Passover. They had to go through ceremonial cleansing, especially if they had been in Gentile territory. And so they would come early for the Passover to do that. It would take several days to offer the sacrifices and so forth to be made ceremonially clean. But they began to talk about whether or not Jesus was going to come. You think he's going to come to the Passover this year? He had always come to the Passover. Ever since he started his ministry, he had been coming to the Passover, and he came to the Passover in years before that. Up until he was 12 years old, we have stories about it. in the Gospels, and that it said that his parents always came to the Passover. And so when he was a child, they always came, and that Jesus always came during his ministry. And so we have to assume that Jesus came all of the years in between as well. But the chief priests had given orders, and they let it be known that if anybody hears of this Jesus, if anybody sees him, if anybody finds out where he is, let us know, because we want to arrest him. Okay, that finishes out John chapter 11. Again, find one preaching point and give me 2 or 3 sentences telling what you would say about that one preaching point, and send it to my inbox on WhatsApp.